The first account comes from a harbormaster's log dated March 18, 1904, Port Angeles, Washington Territory. The entry is brief, written in the clipped style common to such records. Single survivor retrieved from capsized vessel approx. 3 IMI offshore. Male, age est 30 to 35. Responsive, but will not give statement. Physician summoned. The physician's name was Dr. Emmett Hardwick, and his report, preserved in the county archives, provides our earliest detailed description of the man who would come to be known in local memory simply as the Silent One. Patient exhibits no physical injury consistent with drowning or exposure beyond minor abrasions to hands and forearms. Pulse elevated, but steady. Pupils reactive. When questioned regarding the incident, patient becomes unresponsive, not agitated, but profoundly withdrawn. He will not speak his name. He will not speak at all. By the following morning, authorities had identified him. His name was Benjamin Crofter, 32 years old, employed as a timber surveyor for the Puget Mill Company. He had departed 5 days earlier aboard a small logging schooner called the Catherine Ann, along with 4 other men. The vessel had been bound for a tract of old-growth forest on the western coast of Vancouver Island, a routine trip, weather permitting. Benjamin Crofter was the only one who came back. The initial assumption, recorded in the sheriff's preliminary notes, was shock, trauma of survival. The county coroner, a man named Virgil Tate, wrote to the company's Seattle office explaining that the witness would require time before providing testimony. The letter assured them, "We anticipate a full account within the week." That account never came. Over the following days, Benjamin Crofter was visited by the sheriff, by a company representative, by a minister, by the families of the missing men. Each visitor reported the same experience. He would sit quietly, hands folded in his lap. He would meet their eyes, but he would not speak. One of the widows, Mrs. Abigail Renner, whose husband Thomas had been the ship's captain, described her visit in a letter to her sister in Portland. The letter survives in a private collection donated to the Washington State Historical Society in 1962. I thought perhaps he could not bear to tell me. I thought if I asked gently, if I showed him I would not blame him, he might find the words. I told him I only wanted to know if Thomas suffered. I told him I could bear anything except not knowing. He looked at me for a long time. His eyes were not unkind, but he said nothing, and when I began to weep, he stood and left the room. A journalist from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer attempted an interview on March 23rd. The article that ran 2 days later bore the headline, "Survivor of Logging Tragedy Remains Mute. Authorities Stymied." The reporter noted that Crofter had returned to his boarding house, that he had resumed light work in the company's land office, that he appeared to function normally in all respects save one. He would not discuss what happened. By April, the questions began to shift. If he could not speak of it, could he write it down? A magistrate provided him with paper and pen. Crofter accepted both, sat at the table for nearly an hour, and then returned the blank pages. The silence was absolute. In late April, the families of the lost men petitioned for an inquest. The proceeding was held on May 2, 1904, in the county courthouse. Benjamin Crofter attended, accompanied by a company attorney who advised him he was under no legal obligation to testify in the absence of evidence suggesting criminal wrongdoing. The presiding judge, Wallace Breen, was a pragmatic man. His ruling, preserved in the court records, states the matter plainly. No compulsion can extract testimony from a man determined to withhold it, particularly when no crime has been established. The sea claims men. This is the nature of such work. Without a body, without wreckage, without testimony, this court can determine only that 4 men are missing and presumed dead. The matter is closed. But it was not closed. Not for the families, not for the town, and certainly not for the one man who knew. To understand the silence, we must first understand what was lost in it. The crew of the Catherine Ann was not a random assembly of strangers. These were men who had worked together, in some cases for years. The ship's manifest and employment records allow us to reconstruct who they were and, more importantly, how they were known to one another. Captain Thomas Renner, age 41, had been sailing the Puget Sound and coastal waters since he was 16. Multiple testimonies describe him as competent and cautious, a man who would delay a departure if the weather looked uncertain. His wife's letters paint a picture of a steady marriage, modest but content. He wrote to her regularly when away. She kept every letter. The first mate was a man named Jacob Lind, 28, unmarried. Company records show he'd worked under Renner for 3 years. A deposition from another captain describes Lind as quiet but capable, the kind of man you'd want in rough water. The two deckhands were brothers, Samuel and Ethan Voss, ages 24 and 21. They had emigrated from Sweden 6 years earlier and found work in the timber trade. A boarding house owner testified that they shared a room, split their pay, and sent half of it back to their mother in Göteborg. She described them as inseparable. And then there was Benjamin Crofter. His employment file at the Puget Mill Company describes him as reliable, solitary, skilled in cartography and land assessment. He had been with the company for 8 years. A letter of reference from a previous employer in Oregon noted that Crofter was precise in his work and unremarkable in temperament. Unremarkable. The word appears again and again. He had no wife, no children. His boarding house landlady, when interviewed by the sheriff, said he paid his rent on time, caused no trouble, and rarely entertained visitors. He did not drink to excess. He attended church sporadically. He read books on surveying and geology. There is no evidence in any document of conflict between Crofter and the other men. In fact, the opposite appears to be true. A co-worker at the mill office, a man named Harry Deschamps, provided a statement to the company investigator in which he recalled a conversation he'd had with Thomas Renner just days before the departure. Renner had mentioned that he was glad Crofter would be aboard for the Vancouver Island run. A steady head, he'd called him. Someone who wouldn't panic if conditions turned. One of the Voss brothers, Samuel the elder, had apparently worked with Crofter on a prior survey and spoken well of him to the company foreman. The foreman's notes from March 1903 include the observation, "Voss reports Crofter knows his business. No complaints. These were not men thrown together by chance. They trusted each other." The ship itself was sound. The Catherine Anne had been inspected in January 1904 and certified seaworthy. She was a 42-foot schooner, designed for coastal cargo transport. Built in 1891, she had logged hundreds of trips without incident. The purpose of the voyage was routine, to survey a timber tract on the northwest coast of Vancouver Island and mark boundaries for a future logging contract. The trip was expected to take a week, 2 days travel each way, 3 days of survey work. Weather reports from the period show conditions were typical for early March. Variable winds, occasional rain, nothing extraordinary. The Catherine Anne departed Port Angeles on the morning of March 13, 1904. The harbor log notes a southwest wind at 10 knots, light chop. No one saw reason for concern. The last confirmed sighting of the vessel came from a lighthouse keeper on Tatoosh Island, approximately 30 miles northwest of Port Angeles. His log entry, dated March 14th, notes the schooner passing at mid-morning, heading northwest under sail. After that, nothing. No distress signal, no wreckage reported, no survivors, except one. The search began on March 20th, 2 days after Crofter was pulled from the water. A Coast Guard cutter swept the coastline from Cape Flattery to Barkley Sound. They found no debris, no bodies, no trace of the Catherine Anne. The captain of the cutter, a career officer named Lieutenant Horace Milliken, filed a detailed report that now resides in the National Archives. In it, he notes the unusual nature of the disappearance. It is the opinion of this officer that a vessel of the Catherine Anne's size and construction, if wrecked in coastal waters, would produce identifiable debris, planking, rigging, cargo. The absence of such material suggests either that the vessel sank in deep water, far from the surveyed route, or that it was lost under circumstances we do not yet understand. The circumstances we do not yet understand. This phrase would echo through every official document that followed. The company hired an independent investigator, a former Pinkerton agent named Owen Strickland. His assignment was to determine liability and, if possible, recover the company's investment in the lost vessel. Strickland's report, submitted in June 1904, is meticulous and frustrating in equal measure. He interviewed harbor workers, reviewed tide charts, consulted meteorologists. He traveled to Vancouver Island and spoke with indigenous fishermen who worked those waters. None had seen the Catherine Ann. None had heard reports of wreckage. He attempted, multiple times, to interview Benjamin Crofter. Strickland's notes describe a man who was polite, even cooperative, up to a point. Crofter would confirm his identity. He would confirm that he had been aboard the vessel. He would confirm that he had been rescued. But when asked what had happened between the last sighting and his rescue, Crofter would simply stop responding. Strickland tried various approaches. He asked broad questions. Can you describe the weather on the day of the incident? No response. He asked specific questions. Were you struck by a storm? No response. He tried appeals to duty, to the families, to the men who had died. No response. In his final report, Strickland wrote, I do not believe Mr. Crofter is incapable of speech, nor do I believe he is suffering from mental defect. He converses readily on other topics. He performs his work duties without impairment. But on the matter of the Catherine Ann and the fate of the crew, he has erected a wall no inquiry can breach. I cannot compel him to speak. I can only note that his silence, whatever its cause, is deliberate. Deliberate. There were theories, of course. There are always theories. Some believed Crofter had done something, had panicked perhaps, or made a decision that cost lives. Guilt, they reasoned, kept him silent. Others thought he had witnessed something so horrific that his mind had sealed it away for protection. A few, mostly drunks in dockside taverns, whispered darker possibilities. Mutiny. Murder. A fight over something we'll never know. But there was no evidence. No motive. No witness except the one who would not speak. The widows and the mother of the Voss brothers wrote letters. They pleaded. They demanded. They offered forgiveness in advance if only he would tell them what their men had endured. Crofter read the letters. According to his landlady, he kept them in a wooden box beside his bed. He never answered a single one. One detail from the rescue itself deserves mention here, though its significance remains uncertain. The harbormaster who pulled Crofter from the water, a man named Cyrus Dalton, gave a brief statement to the sheriff. In it, he described Crofter's condition when they hauled him aboard the rescue boat. He was floating on a piece of decking, maybe 4 feet by 6. Looked like it had been torn from a hull. He was conscious, holding on with both hands. When we got him in the boat, I asked him if there were others. He looked at me, then he looked back at the water. He looked for a long time, like he was searching for something. Then he shook his head. I asked him again. I said, "Were you alone?" And he nodded. But the way he nodded, I can't explain it. It was like he was answering a different question. Dalton could not elaborate. He only noted that the expression on Crofter's face was not one of relief. It was resignation. Benjamin Crofter lived in Port Angeles for another 14 years. This is what the records show. He continued working for the Puget Mill Company until 1911, when the firm consolidated operations and relocated its land office to Seattle. He declined to transfer. Instead, he took a position as a clerk in a shipping company's warehouse, a significant step down in both pay and responsibility. He moved to a smaller room in a different boarding house. The landlord there, a man named Otto Krebs, later described him in a 1920 newspaper interview as the quietest tenant I ever had. Crofter had no close friends. He attended no social gatherings. He was seen, occasionally, walking along the waterfront in the evenings, always alone. In 1908, 4 years after the incident, Mrs. Abigail Renner made one final attempt. She had moved to Seattle after her husband's death, remarried, and begun a new life. But the question had never left her. She wrote to Crofter and asked if she might visit him one last time. He agreed. Mrs. Renner's account of this meeting exists in a letter she wrote to her sister, dated November 12, 1908. The letter was never mailed. It was found among her effects after her death in 1943. She wrote, I took the ferry to Port Angeles yesterday. I had not seen him in more than 4 years. He has aged. His hair is graying at the temples, though he is not yet 40. He was courteous. He offered me tea. I told him I had not come to accuse him. I told him I had made peace with Thomas's death, that I had married again, that I was content. But I said I needed just once to hear him say he had done everything he could, that Thomas had not died alone, that someone had been with him at the end. He listened. He did not look away, and then he did something I did not expect. He reached across the table and took my hand. He held it for a moment. His grip was firm, almost urgent, and then he let go. He still said nothing, but I understood, or I think I understood. He could not give me the words I wanted, but in that gesture I felt something. Not comfort exactly, but acknowledgement. He had heard me. He knew what I needed, and he was telling me, in the only way he could, that he could not give it to me. I left without asking anything more. There is no indication that Crofter ever spoke to anyone else about the Catherine Ann, but the pressure did not entirely cease. In 1912, a journalist from McClure's magazine, working on a feature about maritime mysteries, tracked Crofter down and requested an interview. Crofter refused. The journalist, his name was Paul Hendricks, did not give up easily. He waited outside Crofter's boarding house. He followed him to work. He sent letters. Finally, according to Hendricks's own account, published years later in a memoir, Crofter stopped on the street and spoke to him directly. It was the only time anyone recorded him addressing the subject, even obliquely. Hendricks wrote, "He did not raise his voice. He did not appear angry. He simply said, 'I will never speak of it. Not to you, not to anyone. You are wasting your time.' I asked him why. He said, 'Because some things should not be said.' I asked if he meant they should not be said aloud, or if he meant they should not be known. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, 'Both,' and he walked away." Hendricks never wrote the article. In 1917, the United States entered the Great War. Men of draft age were called to service. Crofter was 45 by then, well beyond eligibility, but he volunteered for the Red Cross as a supplies coordinator. He spent the war years working in a Seattle warehouse, managing shipments of medical equipment. Co-workers from that period described him as efficient, punctual, and utterly impersonal. One clerk interviewed in 1925 said, "You could work beside Ben Crofter for a year and never learn a single thing about him." When the war ended, Crofter returned to Port Angeles. He resumed work at the shipping company. He lived in the same small room. In early 1918, during the influenza pandemic, the widow of Samuel Voss, who had remarried and moved to Tacoma, wrote to Crofter. She had lost her second husband to the flu. She had no children. She was alone. She did not ask about the Catherine Ann. She only asked if he remembered her late husband, if he could tell her anything about the kind of man Samuel had been in his work in those final days before the voyage. Crofter wrote back. The letter, preserved in a family archive, is brief. "Mrs. Voss, I remember your husband. He was a decent man and a good worker. I'm sorry for your loss. Respectfully, Benjamin Crofter." She wrote again, asking if they might correspond, if he might share any small memory that would help her keep Samuel alive in her thoughts. He did not reply. By the early 1920s, the story of the Catherine Ann had faded from public memory. Logging accidents were common. Men died in the woods, on the water, in the mills. The sea gave up some and kept others. This was understood, but in Port Angeles, among the older residents, the story persisted, not as a tragedy, but as a puzzle. What had the silent man seen? And why, after all these years, did he still refuse to say? Benjamin Crofter died on February 4th, 1918. The cause of death, recorded on the county death certificate, was pneumonia. He was 46 years old. He died alone in his boarding house room. The landlord found him the following morning. There was no will. His few possessions, clothing, a few books, a wooden box, were donated to charity. The wooden box contained the letters from the families of the lost men. He had kept everyone. There was no funeral. No obituary appeared in the local newspaper. He was buried in the Port Angeles Municipal Cemetery in an unmarked grave. The burial record lists his name, his death date, and nothing else. For decades, the story of the Catherine Ann existed only in fading memory and scattered archives. Then, in 1953, a graduate student in maritime history at the University of Washington stumbled across the coroner's report while researching logging industry accidents. Her name was Dr. Eleanor Pruitt, and she would spend the next 12 years attempting to solve the mystery. Dr. Pruitt's work, compiled in an unpublished manuscript now held by the University Library, represents the most comprehensive investigation ever conducted into the disappearance. She interviewed descendants of the lost men. She combed through Coast Guard records, weather archives, and indigenous oral histories. She hired a marine salvage expert to survey the seabed along the presumed route. She found nothing, no wreckage, no remains, no explanation. But she did find something else. In a Seattle archive, she discovered a brief mention of the Catherine Ann in the journal of a Maka elder named James Claplanhu, recorded by an anthropologist in 1931. Claplanhu had been a fisherman in his youth and knew the waters off Vancouver Island intimately. When asked if he remembered anything unusual from the spring of 1904, he mentioned a story that had circulated among the Maka fishermen that year. A white man, he said, had been found floating alone. The man had been pulled from the water by a Canadian fishing crew and brought to shore, then transferred to an American vessel. But before he was transferred, while he was still aboard the Canadian boat, he had spoken. Not much, just a few words. Claplanhu did not remember the exact phrasing, but he said the fisherman had been troubled by it. The white man had said something about choosing. Dr. Pruitt tried to track down records from Canadian fishing boats operating in the area in March 1904. She found scattered logs, but nothing conclusive. She could not verify the story, but she believed it. In the final section of her manuscript, Dr. Pruitt offers her conclusion. It is measured, cautious, and haunting. We will never know what happened aboard the Catherine Ann. We will never know if the vessel struck a reef, capsized in a sudden squall, or succumbed to some other catastrophe. We will never know if the men died together or separately, quickly or slowly. But I believe Benjamin Crofter's silence was not the silence of trauma. It was not the silence of guilt. It was the silence of a man who had been forced to make a choice, and who understood that no one who had not faced that choice could possibly judge it. I believe he survived because of a decision, and I believe that decision, whatever it was, could not be spoken aloud without destroying the memory of the men who did not survive. His silence was not evasion. It was protection. He kept their dignity intact by refusing to explain his own survival. Dr. Pruitt died in 1967 before she could publish her findings. Her manuscript gathers dust. In 1982, a historical society in Port Angeles placed a small brass plaque near the waterfront. It lists the names of the men lost aboard the Catherine Ann and notes the date of their disappearance. Benjamin Crofter's name is not on the plaque, but sometimes, late in the evening, when the fog rolls in off the strait and the water grows still, people walking along the old docks say they think of him, the man who came back, the man who would not say why. And in that silence, which has outlasted all the questions, there remains a kind of awful respect, because some things perhaps should not be said, not because they are too terrible to speak, but because speaking them would betray the only people who deserve to be remembered, the 4 men who went into the water, and the 1 man who chose to carry the weight alone. We do not know what happened. We will never know. And maybe, just maybe, that is exactly as it should be.